Welcome to the broadcast. I'm Armstrong Williams. We pay tribute to our very good friend Sam Faddis, CIA operative who lost his life in today's show. But first, Mark Sanford, former governor of South Carolina, former U.S. congressman, and a candidate for the United States Senate to fill the vacancy of our very dear mutual friend, the late Lindsey Graham. Governor, before I get into the weeds, talk about Senator Lindsey Graham and his legacy.
A remarkable friend to both of us. I think a real patriot, somebody who cared deeply about our country and its direction. Somebody who was a lot of fun. He kept, he never took himself too seriously, and he had this ability to make people laugh because he would again say, "Well, yeah, here's another way of looking at it." And I'll miss that. He was actually the godfather to our youngest son. So Blake and I went to the funeral yesterday.
You know, I guess, what is it that convinced you decided not to run for Congress, but you decided to take a stab at and run in this August 3rd special election to succeed your dear friend?
A lot of friends calling in saying, you ought to look at this, you ought to do this, here's why. B, our four boys and worrying about affordability issues and their ability to sustain and capture their part of the American dream. And C, the fact that we're at a real tipping point as a civilization financially. I've long talked about that. But if we don't get our numbers right in Washington, whether from the standpoint of projecting force around the world or paying for Social Security or paying for Medicare, we're going to have a real problem. We're going to add $1 trillion of debt to the national debt over the next 100 days. And we're not really even having a conversation about that in Washington, D.C. And I think that that's, again, tied to affordability. It's tied to the American dream and something that needs to be talked about and acted upon in Washington.
You know, I know I was so impressed with Darlene Graham's grace, not exploiting his funeral for the microphone to further her aspirations to replace him. And I know this is something that probably deep down she didn't really want it, but President Trump did. Was it tough for you? And what do you say to her as she goes on this journey? Because this is a very tough journey, especially dealing with the loss of her brother.
Yeah, it's for all of it's drinking water out of a fire hydrant. In the a 2-week race is kind of crazy just by its own construct. But add to that, the loss of your brother and the mourning process. It's tough. I've known Darlene over the years, and she's a great lady.
What separates you from the other candidates that's running? Ralph Norman, Fry, and others that want to replace the senator. Obviously, what is it that you have that the others cannot bring, Governor Sanford?
Well, I think it's that executive experience. Those 8 years as governorship. During the 8 years that I was governor of South Carolina, we held the line as has never been done before or after. We actually held government flat in real terms, actually negative in real terms, but flat in nominal terms. And that, did it take a lot of fussing and fighting and me carrying pigs into the State House for a press conference and back and forth and all the acrimony that went with it? But there was a net positive effect for the taxpayers out there, which is we held the line on spending. And so, I've taken my share of tough votes in Washington when I was in Congress, but it is not the same as pushing for it when you are sort of the man on point, if you want to call it that, as governor. And I think we need that perspective and that resolve in Washington if we're going to turn around this financial mess that we've got up in D.C. that's impacting, again, every one of our lives in affordability issues. That's why we're doing this crazy, Mama, I can't buy a new truck tour. I'm in the back of a truck right now. But we're doing it to, again, emphasize what I'm hearing from folks, which is they're struggling. A lot of people are really struggling. And it's not necessarily buying a new truck, but it's buying your first house or putting gas in the truck. And so if we don't, you can't have a Washington, D.C. who goes out and spends money it doesn't have and then prints money that's not there, because the net effect of that is it devalues the value of every dollar you and I have in its purchasing power, whether at the gas pump or at the auto dealership.
Well, finally, The Republican Party has changed dramatically over the past decade. What should it stand for today, and where do you see yourself within that vision?
You know, I believe in Ronald Reagan's notion of a bright, shining city on the hill. I believe in sitting down with your friends and foes alike and trying to work out again solutions that impact people's lives. I believe in financial conservatorship. I mean, we the floodgates have opened with regard to Washington spending under both parties' watch, frankly. And again, we're going to add $1 trillion of debt over the next 100 days. That has real world impact in our lives. And so I think I'm a financial conservative. I think we need another strong voice for financial sensibility in Washington, D.C., and that's what I'd be pushing for.
Finally, how do you see yourself working with President Trump, who remains the dominant figure in the Republican Party, if you were to win?
Yeah, I think well. I mean, what needs to be remembered is when I was in Congress, the 2 years we overlapped, I voted with the administration 90% of the time, 90. And, you know, I love my brothers and sisters, but I don't agree with them 90% of the time. And so, you know, this notion if you're a foe, if you vote with some, that's crazy. I mean, I think that, you know, in the world of half loaves that is the legislative process, if you have congruence on 90% of the time, you're working awfully well together.
Thank you so much for joining us. You're a good man, and I definitely appreciate your taking the time to talk about former Senator Graham, his sister, and about why you're entering this race. And we wish you well.
I appreciate it. Great to see you, Armstrong.
My pleasure. When we return, we look back at the life of our very good friend Sam Faddis, who's passed away. I'm Armstrong Williams. We'll be back. This is why we love Sam Faddis, in his own words. Sam, and I'll start with you, has humbled many empires along the way.
Yeah, well, look, the first thing that the takeaway I have for the Iran war at this point is technology, military competence, all of that, which nobody questions, is no substitute for strategy and for an understanding of the situation and having a clear idea of how you intend to win and what that victory looks like. We went into this, thought this thing was going to be a cakewalk, be over in a matter of days. It is still unclear to me who had that fantasy exactly, but it was obviously not true. And honestly, we're still fumbling around trying to figure out what we're doing next. I mean, we have blockaded the straits. Alone, that is not enough to produce victory anytime soon. And as you well know, look, I on record as having not recommended we begin this war in the first place, certainly not prosecute the way we did, but now we are in it. And the consequences of losing in the Middle East, being perceived as having lost, are, in my mind, unthinkable, because I don't care what press release the White House puts out. If you sign a bad deal and walk away, everybody will know what just happened, and we will pay the price for that.
Mr. Operative, we've lost a giant. I don't think his shoes can ever be filled again by anyone. Put in perspective for us, Mr. Operative, the life and the contribution of our very dear friend who passed away, Sam Faddis.
Armstrong, you've hit the nail on the head with that comment, because when you have, it takes 20 years and multiple presidents to grow an officer like Sam. And the circumstances that created officers like him no longer exist. We certainly don't have the wisdom and the leadership in the system itself to produce people like that. It's an old school shaping and framework that creates officers that will speak truth to power regardless of who they're talking to, because the whole system was created after Reagan was elected to course correct with all the terrible blunders that happened primarily in Iran and other places that spilled from that. So you shaped an entire generation of officers with that framework that no longer exists. And now we're 47 years later, we're in the same mess that we had with Iran in 1979. And there's not a cadre of experienced officers inside the system anymore because of just age and attrition. They're on the outside, and they're doing things like Sam was doing, where trying to educate a larger audience with the foundation of truth and reality in your assessments that you would draw before you go to war. Sadly, where I think we're repeating some of the mistakes of the past because of that. Is a great loss, and you can't fill those shoes.
Talk about Sam as a family man.
Well, he was a product of a generation that spent most of their career outside the United States. You took your family with you. You raised your kids on the move as you moved around the world doing things that mattered. The entire structure was smaller then. It was more of a tight-knit community. We took care of each other. You took care of your kids collectively. There was an infrastructure to use for that within our own system when it came to where to find babysitters that you could trust without real worry or question. And the whole structure of the family that moved around the world working targets and developing substantive expertise on countries and issues that's no longer valued. That's a generational loss because you have to have area expertise, language skills, things like that are no longer valued. We have shifted the attention of the federal executive to other topics and other issues that, quite frankly, are superficial and meaningless in the grand scheme of actually doing your job overseas, so that the leadership of the country has sound, accurate, and unbiased information on which to make hard decisions.
Well, yeah,
like
you got to make
war.
those hard decisions. We're going to come back much more to talk about our friend Sam Faddis on the other side of this break. I'm Armstrong Williams.
Yeah, he says things that trouble me, and people around him say things that trouble me. The Secretary of Defense or War or whatever often makes comments from the podium, and I think, we're at war, and in war you got to kill people. I get it because I've been to war. You don't joke about it, and you don't talk about it like it's a Rambo movie. Most of those guys you're killing are not Ayatollahs. Probably 20-year-old kids who didn't have any choice, and they were ordered into uniform. So, yeah, we got to do it because we're at war. That's what you do. But you don't high-five afterward and make it seem like it was trivial.
Amen. I could not have said it better. That's why we appreciate and respect you so much. Sam Faddis, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Your Voice, Your Future, the Armstrong Williams Show. Mr. Operative, how much has the intelligence changed since the days of operatives like yourself and Sam Faddis?
Armstrong, I think there's been a systemic shift into a focus on things that have weakened our ability and our efficiency in gathering accurate information. I don't think a lot of the changes that happened in the last 20 years in particular have contributed to an improvement of the performance of your intelligence apparatus. I think they have been a detriment and damaged it. There are a lot of decisions that have been made that were feel-good decisions, idealistic decisions, instead of mission focus. When I came in, not to sound like an old dinosaur, but when Sam and I joined, everything was about the human service and the mission of gathering secret information. And if you didn't have enough information, you recruited people in places that you could find that information, and you penetrated it. It was a disciplined structure and a disciplined process. There's nothing random about it. You had a DO directive that told you what the shortfalls were and what you were supposed to be working to alleviate, and you worked against a document. I don't know if those documents are even made anymore. One would question whether there is a process in place, because there were things that was a matrix of measure of success, measure of performance, and if you weren't delivering, you got replaced. They didn't care what you were, or what you called yourself, or how you got in. You were just replaced. You're not delivering what we need. You're out of here. And that was that. I think that was a positive way of doing it. The agency is one of the smallest components, if not the smallest, operational component in the United States government. And human intelligence doesn't cost a lot. Technical intelligence can be breathtakingly expensive because you're building a widget with a contracting apparatus to do something. But plans and intentions remain to this day, regardless of whether people refuse to accept it or not, in the heads of the leadership of the country. And if you're dealing with a dictatorial structure or a centralized power system, you have to have human spies to know what they're planning to do, because they conceal it from you.
Mr.
And you
Operative,
can't get it any other way.
I cannot thank you enough for joining us today to pay tribute to our very dear friend, Sam Faddis, who just passed too soon. We're going to come back with some final thoughts through more of his voice, not our voice, and we'll be back.
Thank you, Arnie.
Taiwan continues to push back aggressively against China. While the United States discusses whether or not they will increase military support, at what point does deterrence become provocation?
Well, in terms of us supporting the Taiwanese.
It seems as though that Trump sort of signaled that he has to rethink this. I don't know whether it has to do with China has decided to get involved to ask Iran to step back. I noticed the president extended his negotiations because he was threatened again. I noticed that Israel has extended its sort of peace agreement with Hezbollah for another 45 days. Does this all culminate as a result of his meeting with Xi?
Well, I'm afraid, the worst case, and I'm certainly afraid that that's the case, that we're seeing a little bit of a softening of our position on Taiwan because we think we're going to get something out of the Chinese for it. That is clearly the danger. I strongly suggest we don't go down that road. I mean, let's just start with this. There are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. Taiwan is not historically a part of Han China. That is not true. Did they under a dynasty occupy Taiwan for a long period of time? Yeah, so did the Japanese, right? So did the Brits and the French and the Germans occupy big chunks of Africa for long periods of time. That doesn't mean that those parts of Africa should now be recognized as historically French. I mean, and the Chinese played this card already with Tibet. They announced that Tibet was also never a part of China, an independent kingdom, an independent culture, independent religion. They announced they were part of China and went in and brutal invasion and destroyed monasteries and killed over 1 million people. So we've seen this movie before.
Well, let me stop you again.
Yeah.
Do you think that Taiwan could become this generation Sarajevo?
Yeah, I mean, look.
I mean, bringing all kind of regional powers around the world into this conflict, because it has that kind of explosive potential. Remember Sarajevo? 100%. Many people may not remember it.
Right, and your reference, I presume, is to 1914.
Yes.
And now World War I.
That's exactly right.
Right. Okay, so you get an archduke that hardly anybody remembers assassinated, and the next thing you know, all of Europe is in a war, killing millions of people for years. Yeah, but the 100%. But the way you avoid that is through clarity, right? The way you avoid that is through making sure that the Chinese understand you don't want to do this and it's not going to turn out well for you. It is the ambiguity and the misreading of cues that leads us down the path to war. I mean, Taiwan is not historically a part of mainland China. So what the Chinese are serving notice of is that they plan to absorb an independent country. This is no different than the Russians announcing they were going to absorb Germany or some other country during World War II.
A voice of moral clarity, the most consistent guest ever on our broadcast. He will be missed, and we salute you, Sam Faddis. Rest in peace. I'm Armstrong Williams.